President Trump is repealing a whole host of vehicle fuel efficiency standards from the Biden era, something that he has long blasted as a, quote, EV mandate.
We're officially terminating Joe Biden's ridiculously burdensome, horrible, actually, CAFE standards that imposed expensive restrictions and all sorts of problems, gave all sorts of problems to automakers.
Under Biden, cars and light trucks were required to get 50 miles per gallon of gas by 2031. President Trump cut that standard back to 34 miles per gallon. The administration says that the change is aimed at easing the cost of living for Americans. Biden's rule would basically force automakers to take a loss on electric vehicles and make up for it by charging more for gas-powered cars. So Trump's move should bring down the cost of cars across the board. But obviously, less miles to the gallon means a higher bill at the pump. But as I mentioned yesterday, gas prices at the moment are pretty low. Ford CEO Jim Farley, one of many automakers to weigh in on the change, said in a statement, quote, "We can make real progress on carbon emissions and energy efficiency while still giving customers choice and affordability." There's that word again. And speaking of easing climate restrictions, the scientific journal Nature has retracted an influential paper that overestimated the economic toll of climate change. The report was used by central banks to help set policy and regulations. And now they're all gonna have to go back to the drawing board because the three scientists who worked on and published the paper last spring now say it has, quote, substantial issues. The article estimated a massive 62% drop in global economic output by the year 2100 if carbon emissions were not curbed. But another team of researchers found that the data used to come up with that number was skewed by problems with data for Uzbekistan. When those numbers were removed, the number went from 62% to 23%. Carbon emissions are still an issue, and that 23% could still have impacts across the globe, but not nearly as catastrophic as 62%. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, the bad data was used by central banks from around the world to model climate change's financial impacts. And who looks to those central banks for financial guidance? Businesses. Like the kind that build infrastructure, the costs of which usually are passed on to customers and consumers like you and me. So yay for that. The authors of the original paper plan to go back and correct the errors before releasing a new version. The central banks, meanwhile, say that they will continue to adjust modeling based on new research and will publish their own long-term scenarios late next year. Malaysia's Transport Ministry said that it's resuming a deep-sea hunt for the remains of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. Do you remember this one? It was the plane carrying 239 people that mysteriously disappeared from radar on March 8th, 2014, vanished, quite literally, out of thin air. Satellite data at the time showed that the plane made a drastic turn off of its flight path, which made no sense, and headed south to the far southern Indian Ocean, where it's believed to have crashed. A year after its disappearance, debris thought to be part of the plane washed up on the remote Reunion Island that's east of Madagascar. There were a ton of conspiracy theories around this disappearance. Like I said, none of this made a lick of sense. My favorite theory, by far, which is absolutely probably not possible, is that the pilots flew to a remote island and landed the plane, and that all of the passengers are living a real-life episode of Lost. But authorities still believe the most likely scenario is a crash in a wide expanse of open water off the west coast of Australia. U.S. marine robotic company Ocean Infinity will search the ocean floor across 5,800 square miles beginning on December 30th. If they find anything, they'll be paid $70 million by the Malaysian government. If they find nothing, they get nothing. For more on these stories and everything else you could possibly want to know, check out the New York Post in print or online. And don't forget, like and subscribe to the New York POSTcast wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube. I promise, you'll be glad you did.